Okay, so I'm Claire Campling. I'm one of the assistant special education needs managers responsible for operations in the special educational needs service. My direct responsibility is for children aged 0 to 11 years, and I've got a colleague, Jan Bailey, who deals with children from age 12 onwards, but actually the handover is between years 7 and 8. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about phase transfers, we call them, but it's essentially for children who have education, health and care plans, and when they are transitioning between one educational environment and another, and to talk a little bit about the statutory process. So I'm just going to give a quick overview. I have also been sent a few questions, so I'm going to cover those at the end. And of course, equally, if anyone on the call today would like to ask anything, do let me know. So in terms of our statutory responsibility, obviously once a child has an education, health and care plan, we have a responsibility to review that, or we delegate that responsibility for schools to hold an annual review of that every year. And then that comes to the local authority and we give a response to that, and there's a statutory timescale. When children are moving schools, we look at that in a slightly different way because we want to start working on that as soon as possible. So the government already set us a deadline for all children who have an education, health and care plan who are aged either the year before they start school, are moving between infant and junior school, or moving from junior school or primary school to secondary school. There's a deadline for their education, health and care plans to be finalised with their new school placement by February the 15th of the year before they start, academic year before they start school. So for this year, for example, the February the 15th deadline has already passed for those children that are due to start school or move schools in September 2022. So what we ask of schools or early years environments is actually they bring the annual review forward in years either 1 if they're moving from infant to junior school, or 5 if they're in primary or junior school. So wherever the annual review ordinarily falls, they would have that in a normal way, but we want an extra one, or for it to be brought forward into the summer term of that year 1 or year 5 that they're in. What that means is the year before that child is due to transfer, a meeting is already held, discussions are already had about where that child is, how they're developing, what their needs look like, what their provision looks like, how that might need to change for that new environment, and for parents to start looking at and exploring that new educational environment. So we ask for that to be held in the summer term, so that's this term now after Easter, and at this point, actually in the next couple of weeks, we'll be doing a little prompt to all our schools just as a reminder that they need to get those annual reviews in. Our hope is that essentially that gives really good up-to-date information. So whenever that child's plan was written, ultimately it gives new and updated information on, as I say, needs, provision and sort of aspirations and what the plan is for that child moving forward. As always, with that annual review meeting and the report that's produced from it, that's recommendations that the school and parents and linked professionals are making. And then it's up to the local authority to make a decision on that. So as I say, summer term annual review is what we ask for. And again, hopefully that's a prompt. And even before that, quite often schools and parents will be having those conversations about visiting the next school, talking to the SENCO, exploring what that environment looks like. And there's something about starting to think about translating what's happening in one environment into that new environment. Now, often that bigger transition is between primary and secondary, but sometimes that can be between infant and junior as well, depending on the size and what the school looks like. What we do ask is if there's consideration for a change of type. So if it's, rather than it just being mainstream to mainstream, if there's consideration with regards to mainstream, maybe to something more specialist, that the school are really providing as much information as they possibly can about why things have changed. So again, that's a prompt that we'll be doing in the next week to schools. It's a reminder to say, actually, if you think there is something more substantial that needs changing, then make sure you've got all your linked professionals lined up, you know, as you always should do for your annual review, but it's particularly important if we're thinking about some sort of quite substantial change. So that annual review is really, really important. And as I say, we send out reminders to schools about this, about the content of what's going in, so that it really helps us to then make decisions, because ultimately when we've got about 1,000 children in Hampshire, so this February the 15th just gone, we had about 1,000 children who were between the ages of R-1, which is the year before they start school, and year 6. That's a lot of children, so we're not going to get out to all of those annual review meetings. So it's really important that the content of that report and the discussions that are had in there are really full, so that we can make good decisions and do good consultations. So when we get that information in the summer term, our next step is obviously to respond to that and let you know what's going on, and also to then begin the process of drafting the education, health and care plan, because we will need to amend it in order to update those child's needs and provision potentially. That's likely unless it's a really new plan, and also to begin the consultation process of contacting the next school, and that could be one school, it could be a couple of schools. Ordinarily we'd be just looking at the local catchment school. That's often a frequently requested things from parents and is sort of an expectation, but it might be that there's an additional preference, so we would also consult that school as well, and that might be another mainstream school that's a preference, or it could be something more specialist, or it could even be something independent. Part of that process is getting all of the information that we possibly can in, so that we can then start to make decisions and move forward with that. Many of these phase transfers are very straightforward, so it's simply a case of moving from one catchment school to another catchment school. Discussions have already been had, straightforward pathway. But for others, if there's a shift and a change, obviously our responsibility is to keep people informed on that. As a service, we're working really hard on that, and there's certainly, in terms of capacity, we've had some issues on that historically. Right now we are ploughing lots and lots of money into induction, training and capacity into the service, so we can have as much contact as we can with parents over that period of time, because we recognise that it's a time of change and it is an uncertain time for parents. So that's a really big piece of work that we're concentrating on at the moment. So throughout that process, it's annual review, and that's held in the summer term. Quite often during the summer holidays, we'll be doing a lot of sort of admin bits and pieces to start the consultation and amending process. What will happen in terms of parents is you'll receive an amended draft plan that won't have a school named in it or anything like that. At that point, it will be just about the amendments that have come out of the annual review. So that will be amendments potentially to your content that you've given as part of the annual review, your thoughts and aspirations, the child's aspirations. It will be about needs and it will be about provision. So those are, when you get an amended draft that comes out to you, those will be the key things you need to look at in order to ensure that you're happy with the content. And there'll be a reply slip that you're given that you complete in order to say either you're happy with content or you're not, and here's your amendment, or that you'd like to have a meeting with the local authority, and that will be your linked officer. It will give you the opportunity to confirm your preference for school, so we can ensure that, because sometimes from the point at annual review, parents might have one view and sometimes it changes in a period of time. So we can make sure with that reply slip that we've consulted the right schools. And that allows you to give hopefully as much information as you can following the annual review on where you are in terms of that draft plan and potential placements. Once we get that feedback, we'll then able to either, as I say, very straightforward process in terms of this continues to be your preference, that's who we've consulted, this is the choice, and that's who we're finalising with, so we'll finalise the plan. Or if there's more discussions to be held, obviously we'll be in contact with you about choices and what to do moving forward. The aim ultimately is to have finalised the children's plans by February the 15th, because that's the deadline. And if, and I think some of the questions that I received before this meeting is, what if by that deadline a school hasn't been identified or we haven't been managed to find one? Well, there are a couple of options for us there. What we really want to do is to finalise plans, because if there's any disagreement or any potential for disagreement, there's a process in which legally parents have a right of appeal, and we need to make sure that parents have got that. So wherever possible, even if we haven't identified or agreed on a school placement, we will aim to finalise the plan by February the 15th. That means that you've then got a sort of a parallel piece of work whereby you have a right of appeal and can follow up that route and have a timely way of doing that, but we will keep on working with you at the same time. So essentially you've got two routes then. That means you've got the legal bit, and it also means that we can keep working together in order to hopefully get to that place of agreement as soon as we possibly can. That is for the younger age group, and I feel like I've babbled quite a lot, but that's trying to do it in a quick nutshell. That is the phase transfer process. When we finalised on February the 15th, the expectation is that then the two schools will work together with you and your child to then look at transition planning. So during that summer term, so from here onwards, in terms of year 6, it will be about doing those planning meetings, those visits, those additional things that your child might need in order to feel safe and secure and comfortable. And the SENCOs in both schools should be liaising and coordinating with that, and obviously with you and your child, so that ready for either reception or year 2 or year 7, that child is well prepared for that new school environment. So that's that age range. I've done it in a very quick whistle-stop way. What I do need to say is for those children or young people that are in secondary school, so from year 11 onwards, that deadline is slightly different. It's March the 31st. So those are our two statutory deadlines in terms of age range. So from year 11 onwards, any child or young person that is moving placement, and as you can imagine, it's more often than not in year 11. For some children, they stay on and have a school that goes further than that, but for most children, that will be at year 11. And then any other point at which they're transitioning, we are supposed to meet that March the 31st deadline in order to confirm what's happening for the next year. That has been problematic for us over the years, and we are working on that hugely. So whereas, so for example, this year we managed to get about 80% of all plans out by March the 31st for year 11 pupils, and we're still working on that. So there's more for us to do, and as a service, we've really identified that as an area of significant need, as it were, for us. So we are in the process of reorganising slightly to ensure that moving forward we can get better and better at those targets, to ensure that as many of those young people and families are really clear, because we're really conscious that these are key and important transition points for those children and young people as well as their families involved. So we are doing all that we can to improve on that moving forward. I think I'm going to take a breath there. And I'm just going to think about the questions that I received prior to this meeting. And some of that was about what happens if a school isn't named and what happens in those circumstances. It is very exceptional and unusual for us to do that, but you know, equally there are those rare cases where we do that. So when I talked about that circumstance of the parallel piece of work, if we have not identified a final placement, there are two options. One could be that we identify the local mainstream school that child would move on to, even though we're clear that there might be disagreement over that. That way we have a named school, it's very clear, and there is somewhere that we've identified for September, but we keep working with parents. So that's one of the options that we might take. If that is clearly inappropriate and that is no option, then we might name a type of school instead. So for example, it might be that we would name a special school for children with moderate learning difficulties, but we haven't been able to identify that placement. They're rare and exceptional circumstances, but as I've been asked the question, I want to make sure that we're clear on that. So by naming that, we give parents a right of appeal. It's clear acknowledgement that we haven't reached a conclusion, and that, you know, there is a right of appeal that parents can take, but our role will be to keep consulting a range of different schools from that February the 15th period onwards. So just to be really clear, if we've named type, then that will mean that we won't have managed to find a maintained Hampshire school that's appropriate. So we will absolutely be consulting independent provisions and providers. So a challenge we've got in Hampshire, along with the rest of the country, so it's a national issue, is a shortage of specialist placements. So there are some circumstances where we're not able to identify maintained, and we haven't been able to identify independent. So in those circumstances, as described, we keep on consulting a larger range. That sometimes means going further afield. It might sometimes involve residential, but of course we keep parents involved in that loop. And we keep on working on that essentially until we find a placement. If for any reason, because that's one of the questions that was asked, by the end of term, and actually we start looking at this at the half term onwards, if we haven't identified a placement by the May half term, and actually even prior to that, we start looking at the other alternatives. Now, for some children, that could be that they can maintain a placement in their current school, and we will work very closely with the school. So again, we are talking about very exceptional circumstances, but for some of those children, we will maintain the placement in their current school, ensure that the provision is in place, and continue with that placement until we have identified an appropriate alternative. For other children, we may have to come up with a package of support where they are educated other than at school. So we will then look at getting in a range of providers in order to ensure that there is tuition in place, there is learning experience, there is community. So it might be mentoring, it could be home tuition, it could be sort of outward bound work. It depends on the needs of the child in terms of what we would then look at in terms of a package of support. They are rare and exceptional circumstances, but as I was asked the question, I thought it was really important to cover that as quickly as I could in this meeting. Sarah, does that cover, do you think, the questions that were asked? And,
well, I'm just looking, I mean, you said they're rare and exceptional, and the question does ask us how many, and it is something I'm increasingly hearing, that schools are being named as a mainstream setting or a specialist setting. Do we know how many, you know, or what percentage of EHCPs being issued in a year are being issued but without a name, just the type of setting?
So I don't have the information with regards to in a year, but certainly in terms of this phase transfer piece of work, you're right, it is increasing, and that is linked to this national shortage of specialist schools places. So what we are finding is where historically we would have, you know, parents would have given a preference for maintained schools in other counties if they're just on the border. Increasingly, we're not able to identify and get those placements approved because they're not within our control, they're within the other authorities' control. And those schools are providing very good evidence about why we can't direct them. So, you know, that's another option for us, to direct a school to take a child, even though they might say no. But if they provide sufficient evidence to say, if you name this for a child, it will be incompatible with the efficient education in the school, then obviously we need to be reasonable in terms of on directing of schools. So that's one issue, the availability of other authority schools for children that live on the border. The other issue is the fierce competition for places in independent schools. So again, historically, we would have gone through that pathway of, if not our own maintained, we'll go to the other authority schools. If not, then we'll go to independent, and that's high cost, but ultimately we need to ensure that we've identified a placement. But because all authorities are in that same set of circumstances, the competition for these independent places is really fierce. So again, we're not in control of the admission of the children in those schools, the independent sector is. And so that's why there is this kind of increasing gap in terms of provision. We are doing a huge piece of work in terms of working with both our maintained and independent sector providers to expand that offer wherever we can. So we now have a commissioning team whose specific role is to be doing that work, to be expanding, to look at block booking, to look at, you know, identifying within these schools as much as we can additional provision and additional placements. But I think as we speak right now, we're probably at 5% of those phase transfer group where we've named placement. But you know, I should say that's really approximate, and almost every day we're getting offers of alternatives, so it does change very quickly in quite a short space of time.
And you said you then start consulting, and somebody's popped a question in the chat. Yeah. In the chat, Charlotte. Start again. Somebody's popped a question in the chat saying, who is it that you start consulting with? Is it family preference? Who else do you talk to in that time?
We would always consult the family preference. So we do that automatically. So if the family have given a preference, we have a responsibility to always consult that school anyway. So that happens anyway. Equally, If we are not able to name that parental preference, we ask the parents if they have any other preferences. So, you know, yes, we absolutely follow that route of any preferences that the parents are coming up with, but we have a placement and commissioning team who, you know, essentially have a list of all independent schools, always adding to that all the time, for children with certain needs and different, you know, so that essentially is sort of a triage list, as it were, of the independent sector. And so we will go, obviously the first port of call is to go nearest to home, as close as possible to home. So that's our starting point. If those schools are either not able to meet needs or are saying they've got no space, then we go a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. So that's the way that we work in terms of our consultation process. Our aim is to concurrently consult as many schools as possible, really, rather than it to be a consecutive process, if that makes sense. And actually we've talked quite a lot about that in the service recently, just to make it really clear to our caseworkers that it's a challenge, isn't it? On one hand, we don't want to do, you know, a scattergun approach to a million different schools, but if we are struggling and if we know that there's going to be problems, to really consult as many schools as we can.
There's just not enough time, is there? There's not enough time between March the 31st and May half term to be,
exactly.
You know.
I mean, ideally that work, you know, that, so we don't wait until February the 15th, obviously. So we're doing that work you know, depending on that child's needs, and, you know, obviously very individualized cases, but ultimately we're trying to do as much of that as we possibly can. Equally, our commissioning team have quite a big role in pushback to our independent sector colleagues about, you know, for example, if we're regularly getting no's to consultations and they're supposed to meet the needs of children with, let's say, social, emotional, mental health needs, why are we getting these put? So we're doing kind of pushback and challenge as well, but they are independent, and that's our difficulty. The other thing to be really clear on is we're doing everything we possibly can to expand our maintained provision. We have really good quality maintained specialist provision and mainstream provision in Hampshire that do a huge amount of really good work. So wherever we can, we are also working hard within, obviously, the capital funding that the government provides to expand those provisions as well. So it's sort of a bit of everything that we're looking at in order to increase what is a huge demand.
Basically, it's talking to the family and then all of the providers out there to try and find a solution. So one of the other questions which kind of follows on from that we got sent was, what provision is being put in place to support children and young people without a placement? And you talked about EOTOS, so however we say it. Yeah.
It's actually EOTIS. I was corrected on this the other day. Yes. Okay.
Education other than in school, then, is it?
Yes.
Okay. Rather than at school. Okay.
There are a few different options, I guess, Sarah. Ideally, wherever possible, our aim is to keep a child on a school's roll, because what we want is coordination of the package. We want teacher involvement. We want it to be teacher-led to ensure that there are key professionals that are supporting the safeguarding, the checking, the commissioning, all of those things that are really, really important in terms of if we're looking at something other than in a school placement. So wherever we can, we will keep a child on a school roll in order to ensure that there's a clear process for coordination and commissioning of that package of support. So on a school roll is our absolute aim and our key emphasis in terms of the SEN team. If a child is not on a school roll for any reason, then of course it becomes our responsibility, and then it's our responsibility to be doing those checks and measures, commissioning and those pieces of work. As a service, we're exploring this more because it is becoming an increasing problem. We're looking at frameworks, we're looking at companies that are out there, and we're looking at potentially sort of expanding our own provision to look at how we can do this better. There is an awful lot of providers out there at the moment, some who are registered, some who are not. So we're doing a huge amount of work to look at essentially approved providers. You know, we're not there yet, but there's an awful lot of work to be done with that, and again, that's part of our commissioning team's piece of work. And actually the green paper that's just come out, which is a review of SEN nationally, is really concentrating on that in terms of that looks like it will be a focus moving forward for authorities and government, is to look at these alternative provisions, which can be really positive and successful for children who've got really individualized needs, but just ensuring that registration, commissioning, you know, safeguarding, and also monitoring of development and progress. So, you know, yes, this sounds really good, but what does that really mean for that child, and where does it take them, and how is that preparing them for the next? So I don't know if that answered the question actually.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, and I've just made a note, because one of the other things you mentioned about was potentially staying on roll at the school they're at. And I just wanted to go back to that to understand what that meant. So would that mean that a child who is of year 7 age stays in a school in year 6, or do you mean where there's an option to continue at a school in a peer group, but the preference was to change?
I'm just
sorry, did I explain that?
So what we have done very exceptionally is for a child that is transitioning into year 7, that they've stayed on at that primary environment. It's very exceptional.
Keep them on roll.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it could also mean, sorry, I'm just thinking what you just said, Sarah, it could also mean that latter, that obviously if a child, you know, were we looking at an all through school, but actually the expectation was the child was going to move on but couldn't, it would absolutely be keeping them on roll. So if there's, you know, we don't take children off roll unless it, you know, essentially we keep them on roll wherever we possibly can, because that is the safest option in terms of supporting that child and ensuring there is a good range of people and support mechanisms in place for them.
Of points, almost going back further in the process. So somebody has asked, which annual review meetings do the county attend? Because if you've got these 1,000 children transitioning, they don't all get attended. So which ones are prioritised that county attend?
I mean, there's a range. Obviously, we would prioritise children who are looked after. You know, that's obviously a key group. But it is about changing of placement, severity of needs, concerns. You know, it's that sort of thing. And it will depend a little bit locally about the team that are in place and the numbers and what they're capable of doing, if that makes sense. So it really is about the school making contact or parents making contact. If there are significant concerns, then we will concentrate on those ones. So it is those often who are looking at change of placement would obviously be a priority, and additional factors on top of that. So, you know, for example, if a child wasn't attending school or had a reduced timetable, or do you know what I mean, if there were additional factors on top. So we prioritize that on an individual basis, which is not a very helpful way of describing it, but we just have to work in that way.
And the other one was you talked about if at that transition point, schools gathering evidence, particularly if it's transition between 2 different types of school, etc. What happens where there's a difference in opinion between what the schools think is the best next chapter and what the parents thinks is the best next chapter?
So there's an option for that disagreement, as it were, within the annual review report. So whether we're there or not, there's clear places within the annual review for the parents to give their views, for the school to give theirs, and for any disagreements to be identified. So as I explained earlier, the annual review meeting and the report that's produced is a recommendation, and then it is up to the local authority to then make a final decision on that. So as much information as can be gathered at that point is really, really helpful. Otherwise, we might get it through the consultation process. For example, if a parent gave a preference for a school but then changed their mind, it might be that we'd ask for a bit more information about why they changed their mind. Do you know what I mean? So it's always, as much information as can be provided at those points is always really, really helpful. But it is ultimately the local authority's decision to make, and that's why it's important that we make it early and we do it in that timely way, because if we do disagree, whilst we'll keep working on it together with parents, it's important that there's a right of appeal there, because that's the point of it.
And we want to work towards September, don't we, and having a decision in place that everyone agrees with. Yeah. I've got a question come in that's quite special. It's quite narrow, but I'll ask it if it's not. And if a child is at an independent section 41 school and is too ill to attend, whose responsibility is it to provide the therapies and medical tuition? Medical tuition? Maybe music, I'm not sure. Others I presume are actually on an EHCP. So if you're in an independent school, you've got an EHCP, but you're too ill to attend, whose responsibility is it to ensure that those things actually carry on happening?
It's a really good question. And again, this is an area that we're seeing, not independent schools, but generally we're seeing as an increase, and I suspect that it's associated with the pandemic, being in and out of school, time at home. So we are seeing this as an increasing issue. So it ultimately, we would work with that independent school about putting an appropriate package of support in place. We do have an inclusion service whose responsibility it is, when a child is too unwell to attend school, to put in place a package of support. However, if a child is in an independent environment, obviously the SEN team commission that from them. So as a starter for 6, we would be working with that environment to put something in place. If there are problems around that, then it is the SEN services role to mediate that and to get to a place where, as soon as possible, that child is getting some provision that's appropriate, given that they're too unwell to attend school, if that makes sense.
It does. Just looking down our list of questions that we'd had, one of them was how many EHCPs are outstanding. Are you in a position to share that with us, or an idea?
What, from phase transfers?
Well, no, it's just how many, the question is just how many EHCPs are outstanding. I know, I'm just trying to flick through my notes as to what I was last given as a...
So in terms of phase transfers, we've met the deadline where we've got 100% of those younger age groups out. So if we're talking about phase transfers, actually I don't have the date today of where we are with the older age groups. As I say, we were at 80% probably about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. That will have changed. We have currently about 1,500 cases that are within the assessment process, if that's the question, in terms of the new assessments that are received. So that's about how many cases we've got within that system currently.
And the other thing that's just popped up on my timeline is, are we able to share a copy of the current SEN staff structure? Now, I know it's something that I get asked quite a lot because people feel a little bit in the dark about who's who at the moment.
Yes, we are just in the process of reorganising. So I would say by half term. So if there are essentially keep in contact with the people you have been, that nothing changes, and if essentially keep with what you've been doing ordinarily, but we will be. So we're just in the process of moving to the age range that I described right at the beginning, which is the 0 to age 11 and then age 12 upwards. So we will be releasing that probably just for half term.
So there'll be a caseworker who kind of works with you through primary, and then when you transition, but not at transition because you've got an extra year in it.
No, specifically for that reason, the caseworker stays with you during that transition period into secondary. Once they're settled in year 7, then the year 8 starts to look at preparation for adulthood, and that is our absolute drive and push, is really looking at preparation for adulthood, because we need to move schools on with that. We need to move colleges on with that. We need to move our linked services with us on that, so that we are more streamlining that process. So it's, for us, that's one of the key reasons we're looking at this age range organisation, is to ensure that we are really pushing and working hard on the preparation for adulthood goals.
Super, thank you. Okay, I think we've covered all the bits that fall into your hat, as it were, at this point in time. Bex, hello. Right, I've got some really generic questions. I know you haven't seen these, but if I ask them and you could say, or you can. So one of the questions is just, what is the health team's role within sort of an EHCP? Because we reel off education healthcare plan, and I think people aren't necessarily aware where health actually does get involved. Are you able to give us a little bit of a spiel on where it does?
Yeah, I can give you a bit of involvement from what I understand it to be. So when I sit on the Isle of Wight EHCP panel, which is fantastic, it's split up into 2 sections, and I sit on there as my DDCO role, so my Deputy Designated Clinical Officer role, and I'm also Service Development Manager for Special Educational Needs, so I can sit on there with 2 hats. And predominantly it is education local authority staff that have an input into the HCPs, but we are there to have an input with anything health related. So for instance, we had a child last week that had quite complex needs, and they were looking for our thoughts as to what provisions we can put in place and how we can support that child and young person within their education timeline. I also sit on a quality assurance panel for EHCPs as well, to make sure that the health provision has been allocated correctly, and that we do think it is available and an NHS commissioned service as well. We do also, oh God, I can't think where I was going with that. Yeah, so I sit on the two different panels, so an EHCP panel and a quality assurance panel as well. I do also get involved with any tribunals as well that come through. So if there's a tribunal that comes through, so if somebody appeals the EHCP that's been they've been provided with, or the education setting been provided with, if they don't think that it's the correct provision has been listed, or the correct terminology has been listed from a health point of view, that will come through to the DCO team, and we'll assess what evidence was provided and suggested at the time and make changes accordingly. Sometimes there are no changes, that what has been suggested is correct, and unfortunately it may not be the outcome that somebody wanted, but sometimes things do get missed and provision does need to be changed and adjusted accordingly. So that is where our health input comes into the HCPs.
I think sometimes it's a grey area, isn't it? Because we often see therapies included within EHCPs, and I think sometimes there's confusion as to whether they sit with Claire in education or whether they sit with yourselves in health, because we're potentially talking about speech and language therapy or occupational therapy and bits and pieces that we see as health. So where do they sit, those bits?
It is a tricky one, and it is a grey area, which is why things like multidisciplinary team panels are perfect for EHCP, so that we can have a multitude of professionals in one room to make sure that we can clear up those grey areas. Therapies is commissioned by the NHS. Okay. So I suppose the responsibility is down to the NHS and commissioners and the CCG. How it links into the education, the child's education, does also link in through the local authority as well. So it is definitely a grey area, but it is something that we constantly work together with and constantly try and collaboratively make decisions and inputs into the children's health.
And one of the questions we were sent was, how do we get health included in an EHCP discussion? Now, health is that's a massive
how do
thing.
How do we
get health included in EHCP discussions? And that is a massive thing. But for instance, I can imagine that's coming from a parent who perhaps feels that their child has anxiety or could do with a relationship with CAMHS. Now, how does that at the moment doesn't necessarily seem to be something that is naturally included in an EHCP, and yes, it is an EHCP. So I don't know whether you have any thoughts on how something like that, or whether Claire does.
I wonder if it would be helpful for me to just that there's pathways essentially, isn't there? So ultimately, before an education, health and care plan, there should be available access to all of these services pre an education, health and care plan. So it would absolutely be the expectation that schools and parents are working together on actually a referral to CAMHS would be appropriate, or ultimately it's going through GPs to look at exploring these various areas. So that would always be the sort of starter for six, really, is that Absolutely. Sort of, I would call it SEN support, really, that available offer to everybody. You don't need a plan for this. You go through your GP in the normal way in order to get those referrals. So that would be the starting point. Schools can support with that. I know, sometimes Senkos will come along to meetings and support parents with that if they need help with it. But it really is that ordinary health referral route and that are available to all children. I think as we go along, so once a child has a plan, or through the assessment process, when we do our health referrals, that H bit of it, we contact the designated medical officer in each of the CCGs in order to get that health advice. So what we'll be saying is, are they known to you? Is there any additional information? If they're known to you, can we have a report? That sort of thing. Equally, if parents are identifying something as part of their assessment process, then we would be referring back to school or parents about routes in. So I think the challenge for us is the EHC needs assessment process doesn't leapfrog a CAMS referral, for example. It doesn't leapfrog, a consultant involvement. So it really is about getting in there early, doing that stuff because it is available pre-EHCP, if that makes sense, and going through that ordinarily available process from health and those pathways in. Equally, once a child has an education, health and care plan, at any point, if those health professionals become involved, then we'd expect that to be part of the annual review process. So essentially, if a child has been on a waiting list, for example, to get a diagnosis for ASD or for autism or something like that, we would use the annual review process to say, okay, there's an update here is the report, and then the plan is amended accordingly to ensure that those elements are either within, and I think, Sarah, you raise a really good point. Essentially, it depends on what that health input is providing as to which section of the plan it would go in. Ordinarily, if it involves training a child in any way, educating or training a child, then it would go within the education section. If it is about caring for the child, it would go within the social care section. And if it is a health provision to do, physically a health provision, often that's what I'm going quite basic, because of course there are always the nuances, but essentially if it's about education and training, then we would include, for example, speech and language therapy into the education element of the plan. I
think that's where the confusion arises sometimes as to where it fits with everybody. I've got it's more currently more of a comment, than a question. Here we go. Saying we've really struggled with the perceived health side because it keeps being kicked back to say talk to others or pay private. My young person needs OT and speech and language therapy. We're new to all this and it's so confusing. The Senko and Sendias told us it should be included, so we requested the assessments, but the local authority refused, saying if we got it done they would add it after, so it wouldn't be worth the paper it was written on after he leaves year 6.
I don't quite understand I guess ultimately the health team do have thresholds, of course. So the speech and language therapy service would have thresholds about whether they would carry out an assessment or whether they wouldn't, whether it is a language need or whether it's a global need, for example. And so we are minded, of course, if professionals are giving us advice that an assessment is or isn't needed, then as an authority, that is advice that we would take on board and use as part of our decision making on assessment. So it is based on the evidence that we get as to whether we would include advice or we wouldn't, or whether an assessment would be done or they're not. So if the speech and language therapy team, for example, are saying this child's needs don't meet the criteria for assessment, then we would use that evidence to then make a decision on what to do. Of course, if we get new advice or we get new information, we will always review this. So it is always based on the information that we get in, because we are not for example, a speech and language therapy service.
And I think the issue is how you even access the person to say whether or not there is evidence, because one of the other questions is whose responsibility is it to contact the doctors, etc. And it's a tricky time to talk to doctors. So I think it's all just compounding everything, because when you can't, it's really hard. So I can see where people are coming from and saying, potentially this is needed, but we're struggling to build a portfolio of evidence because nobody will see us.
I think there are a range of ordinarily available services. So, for example, within schools, they will have a pack of support all around speech and language therapy. They should have staff that are trained in that specifically. And I suddenly lost you. I touched the screen. Are you still there?
Yeah, we're still here.
I can't see anybody and I don't know.
You need to look on your little bar on the bottom for the picture of Zoom, and if you click that, we should pop back up. I do that all the time. It's really freaky.
Sorry, I had a sudden moment there and lost track slightly. So there are a range of services that are out there to support schools to do this, so that there is stuff in education in terms of training that the school can look at and support. We have outreach from our special schools, so there are things within education that can support that evidence gathering. So also that kind of lower level kind of language development and support work, so that essentially if a school can be saying we've done all of these things and yet we still feel this child has additional needs, that can help in two pathways. One being the evidence with regards to an assessment, an EHC needs assessment, but the other is evidence with regards to the referral that then goes into the speech and language therapy service.
And I suppose part of the question, and again I've got something else similar coming up, is would the SEN team effectively call in the health team if they felt that a child had complex needs that perhaps were beyond the bounds of what you could ordinarily offer within education? See what I mean? It's kind of, because otherwise when I think the sort of the feeling I'm getting from the messages coming through is that the parents aren't the professionals. They're not able to
absolutely,
they're not able to assess whether their child needs this or not. So how do they access the person who is going to say yes my child does or no my child doesn't? And if what we're saying to them is, well, you need to go privately, that's obviously, yeah.
So there is a standard referral process for speech and language therapy, and I'm not an expert on that by any means, but there is a standard process that parents can do as well as schools, and GPs can get involved with. So there is that standard route. There is an element of, in terms of English, as it were, literacy and language, that is a skill set within schools. So there is those packages of support that are already provided. So there is that kind of lower level, that's not quite right, because actually there's a huge amount of skills and expertise in our schools with regards to that, but there's that level of audit trail and evidence. We do also commission a communication and interaction team within the authority. So we also commission, generally speaking, the NHS are ordinarily involved with children who have speech and language difficulties, identify speech and language difficulties up to year 2. So that's in infant school, and from year 3 onwards our communication and interaction team get involved, and they are both speech and language therapists as well as specialist teachers. So they work in liaison, as it were, to ensure that what a child needs, a school can then do and are appropriately trained up to do. And the communication interaction team run a whole host of training opportunities for schools, so are working really hard to skill up schools generally to have that skill set, not only to identify needs but also to put in place provision to meet those needs, and also that comes back in, if a speech and language therapist is involved, that the school can then carry out what a speech and language therapist is putting in place.
So I think
there is capacity issues in every single service.
I think what we're saying is parents need to flag stuff, don't they? And it's not enough to walk into an EHCP meeting and say, I think my child needs, if you haven't been to the GP and said, can we have a look at what's available here? And then, so actually the parent needs to ensure that they are flagging those things, not just on an annual review, but with a GP, with a ordinarily available health professional, and exploring what's out there, which will then feed back into the EHCP. Sorry, Bex, we took off without you there. Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's great.
Was there anything else you wanted to add, Bex, on that?
No, you covered everything, Claire. Thank you.
I think this is where it becomes so confusing, isn't it? Because the NHS theoretically provides the service, but it's kind of commissioned via the SEN team, and it becomes, I think, terribly confusing for parents as to who you're talking to and who is responsible for, the provision. And I think that sometimes means as parents we forget that we can still go to our GP to talk about something. Absolutely. Like speech and language therapy or OT, and perhaps try to fix it, from the wrong starting point, perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've just about covered. Oh,
I am still here. I've just had to turn my camera off, but I am here.
It always throws me when the screen.
Sorry.
Okay, it's absolutely fine. Don't apologise. I think we've covered just about everything, and I'm looking down my little list of questions, and I think we're doing very well. What we're going to do, for those of you on the call, is in future, to give our advice givers as much help as possible, if you have questions ahead of the call, it's really fantastic if you can email them into the participation email address at HPCN. It won't always be possible, and a presentation will obviously throw up questions, but if you have something that needs a detailed answer, or you need a bit more information perhaps in order to answer, that would be absolutely fantastic. Just got a little bit more info on one of the bits that I've got in. So I'm going to read out this comment, but it's detailed, and we probably can't go into this particular case. So a young person's diagnosis and EP report evidenced a need for therapies, and it's why parents are frustrated, because we're trying to get the NHS OT pack into school, but the Senko says that it isn't suitable for him. I think it's that same thing with schools saying one thing, and you know, I think when somebody's in that position, what is then best next port of call, Claire?
It depends a bit where they are in the I mean, there are a number of different options, aren't there? If there is stuff in a plan, then it's a legal responsibility for the schools to carry it out, or the OT involved, or the therapist. Do you know what I mean? So that there is something about what's written in the plan, as so what is in section F of the plan and how is that described. So that's one bit of it. If we're not talking about the plan and we're talking about sort of pre-plan stuff, then obviously if there's recommendations from a therapist, ordinarily a school would carry it out. If they can't, or they are refusing in some way, then ideally we'd be looking at kind of a multidisciplinary meeting where the professional, you know, if it's the OT and the Senko maybe, and parents get together and kind of talk those things through. If for some reason it feels a bit like a block or whatever, of course there is a complaints process within school, and you can sort of follow that bit through. So it's a bit about where it is. It could be that if there's a change in need and a therapist is now involved, then it needs and the child has got a plan, then an annual review would be the right route in order to look at changing what's in the plan, if that makes sense. So it depends a little bit about where the child,
it looks to me a bit like one we should be exploring on our parent-led engagement with a little bit more detail, rather than perhaps here. So if that's your question, we do parent-led engagement sessions where we can actually look in a little bit more detail at specific things, and our next one is May 17th rings the bell, but I'm just going to flick, May the 17th. So if you wanted us to look at that in a little bit more detail, it's often Claire, and we can just unpack it a little bit more and actually sort of see where we can go with you. It does sound a little bit like school is, you know, sort of dragging their heels slightly perhaps, and other bits and pieces. So Claire and Bex, thank you for your time today. I know we never quite know where these sessions are going to go, so thank you very much for being here and supporting us and answering the questions. I know it is appreciated by our parents that, you know, you come and you join us. I'm going to turn off the recording